It was the most glamorous night of the year. The venue glowed with golden light and the champagne flowed like water, promising a celebration of beauty. But beneath the expensive silk gowns and the polite applause, there was only a cold, ugly greed. I'm Madison Berry, and as my mother prepared to take credit for my life's work inside that warm hall, I stood shivering in the freezing rain, remembering the exact moment she chose money over her own daughter. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. Sometimes the sharpest cuts don't come from scissors. Shh, clack. That is the sound of my life. It is the sound of heavy steel, dressmaker shears slicing through Italian silk. It is a violent sound if you really listen to it. You have to be decisive. You cannot hesitate. If you stop halfway through the cut, the fabric will fray. The edge will be ragged. You have to commit. Shh, clack. My name is Madison Berry. If you read the society pages or if you follow fashion, you likely know my last name. The Berry Atelier. We are known for bridal couture. We are known for beadwork so fine it looks like morning dew on a spider web. But you probably don't know my face. That was always the arrangement. My mother, Eleanor Berry, was the face. She was the one with the bright smile and the champagne glass. She was the one who charmed the investors and kissed the cheeks of the brides. She was the light in the room. I was the hands. I was the one in the back room. I was the one with the measuring tape around my neck and the pin cushion strapped to my wrist. I was the one with the bleeding fingers at 3 in the morning, stitching a hem because the machine was too rough for the fabric. I didn't mind. I loved the silence of the workroom. I loved the structure of it. You can control a pattern. You can control a seam. If you make a mistake, you can unpick it and start again. People are not like patterns. You cannot simply unpick a betrayal. I was standing on the corner of 7th Avenue in New York City. It was November, and the city was angry. The rain wasn't a romantic mist. It was a cold gray sheet that soaked right through the shoulders of my wool coat. It was the kind of damp that settles into your bones and makes you ache. Across the street, the venue was glowing. It was Fashion Week. The old warehouse had been transformed. Golden light spilled out onto the wet pavement every time the massive doors opened. I watched town cars pull up to the curb. I watched women in furs and men in sharp tuxedos rush from their cars to the entrance, laughing dry warm. I knew that warmth. I knew the smell of the lilies they always put in the foyer. I knew the taste of the dry wine they were serving. I should have been inside. I should have been backstage holding a steamer, shouting at a model to stand still. I should have been fixing a veil. Instead, I was shivering on the sidewalk, clutching a wet purse against my chest. I was an outsider, a ghost haunting my own life. It had happened 3 weeks ago. That morning had started like any other. I walked to the atelier on 57th Street. I had a coffee in one hand and my sketchbook in the other. I was excited. I had just finished the final drafts for the Bridal Renaissance collection. It was going to be our masterpiece. I put my key in the lock of the staff entrance. Click, thud, it didn't turn. I frowned. I thought perhaps the rain had rusted the mechanism. I jiggled it. I tried again. Click, thud, nothing. I felt a cold prickle on the back of my neck. It wasn't the weather. It was instinct. Then the door opened. But it wasn't my assistant and it wasn't my mother. It was a man I had never seen before. He was wearing a security uniform. He was large, broad-shouldered, and he looked embarrassed. "Ms. Berry," he asked. "Yes," I said. "Why is the door locked? I have a fitting in 20 minutes. He didn't look me in the eye. He looked at his shoes. He reached behind the door and picked up a cardboard box. It was a small box. It had a few photos from my desk, my favorite pair of shears, and my coffee mug. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, handing me the box. "I've been instructed not to let you in. The locks were changed last night." I stood there on the pavement. The coffee in my hand went cold. "By who?" I whispered, but I already knew. My phone rang 10 minutes later. It was Eleanor. I expected her to be screaming. We had argued before, of course, creative differences. But when she answered, her voice was calm. It was chillingly steady. It was a business voice. "It's for the best, Madison," she said. "You locked me out," I said. My voice was shaking. "You locked me out of the shop. My sketches are in there." "They aren't your sketches anymore," she said. "They are assets of the company, and I have sold the company's latest assets." I felt the ground tilt beneath me. "What did you do?" "I sold the Bridal Renaissance collection," she said. "The whole line, the patterns, the prototypes, the branding. I sold it to the Kleinsman department store group." I gasped. "Kleinsman, mother. They sell polyester suits and discount shoes. They don't do couture. They will ruin it. They paid $2.5 million. Madison," she said. "Cash." "But the dresses aren't finished," I cried. "The beadwork isn't done. The corsets need boning." "They have their own factories," she said dismissively. "They will finish them in time for the show. You are too emotional, Madison. You've been working too hard. Everyone agrees you are unstable. I'm doing this for you. I'm taking the burden away." "You're stealing my work," I said. "I made those. I drafted them." "I am the owner," she said, "and I have a show to produce. Go to the country, Madison. Take a vacation." She hung up. That was the cruelty of it. It wasn't just the theft. It was the dismissal. She treated me like a servant she had fired for breaking a plate. I checked my bank accounts. An hour later, she hadn't touched my personal savings. I had a modest portfolio enough to survive, but she had cut me off from the business accounts. She had cut me off from my legacy. For 3 weeks, I sat in my apartment. I stared at the wall. I grieved. I felt a deep, hollow ache in my chest. It is a terrible thing to realize that the person who is supposed to love you most in the world loves money more. But grief eventually turns into something else. If you let it sit too long, it hardens. It turns into resolve. So I stood in the rain outside the venue. I looked down at the ticket in my hand. It was crumpled and wet. I had bought it from a scalper 3 blocks away for 3 times the face value. It was a standing room only ticket, the kind given to students and interns. I wasn't there to scream. I wasn't there to beg her to let me back in. I wasn't there to cause a scene in front of the cameras. I just needed to know. I needed to see what they had done to my girls. That's what I called the dresses my girls. I needed to see if the Kleinsman factories had treated them with kindness, or if they had butchered them. I took a deep breath. The air smelled of exhaust and expensive perfume. I walked toward the golden doors. The security guard checked my ticket. He didn't recognize me. Why would he? I was just the hands. I walked through the heavy curtains and into the main hall. The music hit me first. It was a heavy thumping bass. Boom, boom, boom. It vibrated in the floorboards. It felt like a second heartbeat in my chest, aggressive and loud. The room was packed. The runway was a long strip of white light, blindingly bright. I moved to the back into the shadows, leaning against a pillar. I closed my eyes for a second, listening to the murmurs of the crowd. They were expecting magic. They were expecting the Berry legacy. I opened my eyes and looked at the empty runway. "Show me," I whispered to the empty air. "Show me what you did." We've all had moments where we felt unheard or pushed aside by someone we trusted. It's a heavy feeling to carry. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes. The hallway leading backstage was guarded by two men the size of vending machines. They wore headsets and scowled at anyone who didn't look like they belonged on a magazine cover. I didn't have a pass. My laminate, the one that said creative director, was likely in a trash can somewhere in Midtown, thrown out by my mother 3 weeks ago. But I knew something about backstage security. They don't look at faces, they look at posture. If you walk like you own the building, people assume you do. I pulled my wet coat tighter around me, lifted my chin and walked straight toward the gap between them. One of them stepped forward. "Badge," he grunted. "Don't be ridiculous," I snapped, not even slowing down. "The zippers on the finale gown are sticking, and if I don't get back there with a bar of wax in 30 seconds, there won't be a finale. Do you want to explain that to Eleanor?" He hesitated. The name Eleanor Berry terrified people. She was known for throwing staplers when things went wrong. "Go ahead," he muttered, stepping back. I slipped past him and pushed through the heavy black curtains. The noise hit me instantly. If the front of the house was a thumping heart, backstage was the nervous system in full panic mode. It was a wall of sound. The hiss of industrial strength hairspray, the screech of clothing racks rolling over concrete floors, the frantic shouting of dressers calling out names. "Where is the belt for look 5? Who has the belt? Don't touch the hair." I said, "Don't touch the hair." The air was thick with the smell of acetone burnt hair and nervous sweat. It was a chaos I knew better than my own apartment. Usually, this noise soothed me. It meant work was happening. But tonight it felt like a crime scene. I kept my head down and weaved through the maze of half-naked models and panic-stricken interns. I needed to find the rack, the bridal renaissance rack. I found it in the far corner near the loading dock doors. It was guarded by a young assistant I didn't recognize. She was texting frantically, her back to the clothes. I stepped into the shadow of a lighting rig and just looked. From 10 feet away, they looked like my designs. I recognized the silhouettes. There was the drop-waist ball gown with the cascading tulle. There was the mermaid cut with the illusion neckline. My sketches had come to life. But as I stepped closer, the illusion shattered. I reached out and touched the sleeve of the nearest gown. My stomach dropped. It wasn't silk charmeuse. It was a synthetic blend. It was cold, slippery, and cheap. I rubbed the fabric between my thumb and forefinger. It had no grain. It was the kind of fabric you buy for a high school prom dress, not a 5-figure couture gown. I moved down the line, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked at the embroidery. On my original prototypes, I had spent 3 months hand-stitching French lace onto the bodices. Here, it was an applique, a machine-made patch that had been heat-pressed onto the fabric. I could see the clear film of the adhesive around the edges. "Oh my God," I whispered. She hadn't just stolen the designs. She had butchered them. I realized then what had happened. Eleanor couldn't sew. She couldn't draft a pattern to save her life. When she locked me out, she didn't have the finished gowns because I hadn't finished them. I still had the bodices on my dress forms at home, so she took my sketches, she took the measurements, and she sent them to a rapid manufacturer, probably a factory overseas that churned out thousands of units a day. She had mass-produced a couture line in 3 weeks. I knelt down to check the hem of the finale dress, the showstopper. It was supposed to be a heavy beaded gown that weighed 30 pounds. I lifted the skirt. It was light. Too light. I turned the hem over. There were no stitches. It was glued. A strip of industrial fabric tape held the hem in place. I felt sick, physically sick. This wasn't just bad taste, it was dangerous. A gown this heavy required structural engineering. You needed a corset built into the lining to hold the weight of the beads. You needed reinforced seams. I checked the zipper. It was plastic painted gold to look like metal. Hey! I froze. I stood up slowly and turned around. Madison Berry was standing 5 feet away. She looked magnificent. I had to give her that. She was wearing a tuxedo suit in ivory silk, one I had made for her 2 years ago. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe, elegant chignon. She held a glass of champagne in one hand and a clipboard in the other, but her eyes were cold. She didn't look surprised to see me. She looked annoyed, like I was a stain on the carpet she had forgotten to have cleaned. I told security to keep the riffraff out, she said. Her voice was smooth like velvet wrapped around a knife. The zippers are plastic, Mother, I said. I didn't scream. I was too horrified to scream. She took a sip of her champagne. They are gold-colored. That is what matters on the runway. They are plastic, I repeated, stepping toward her. And the hems are glued. You used fabric tape on a bridal gown. She sighed a long, bored exhale. It is a prototype, Madison. The department store doesn't care about your precious blind stitches. They care about the look. They care about the brand. The brand is quality, I hissed. That is the only thing we have. Why did you do this? She stepped closer, invading my space. She smelled of Chanel No. 5 and money. Because I was tired of being poor, Madison, she whispered. Do you know how much debt we were in? We owed $12,000 in back taxes on the building. We owed the fabric suppliers another $40,000. You were in the back room playing with beads while I was out here begging the bank not to foreclose on us. I stared at her. You never told me. Because you are an artist. She spat the word like it was an insult. You don't understand business. The Kleinsman Group offered me $2.5 million for the name and the designs. Do you know what I can do with that money? I can live. I can finally breathe. By selling them garbage? I pointed at the rack. You charged them millions for costumes, Mother. This is fraud. She laughed. It was a sharp, brittle sound. It's fashion, darling. It's all smoke and mirrors. The models will walk, the cameras will flash, the buyers will sign the check, and by the time anyone notices the stitching, the money will be in my offshore account. She checked her watch. A diamond Cartier I had never seen before, probably bought with the advance. You need to leave, she said. The show starts in 5 minutes. I looked back at the showstopper dress. It was hanging on the end of the rack. The bodice was covered in heavy glass beads, cheap glass, not crystal, which made them twice as heavy. I looked at the thin synthetic straps holding it up. Mother, I said, my voice dropping, listen to me. I am not talking about the money. I am talking about physics. She rolled her eyes. Oh, here we go. That silk is a polyester blend, I said urgently. It has no tensile strength. You have put roughly 15 pounds of glass beads on a bodice that is supported by a plastic zipper and synthetic thread. It looks fine, she said, turning away. It looks fine hanging on a rack. I stepped in front of her, blocking her path. But when a model puts that on, when she walks, the kinetic energy is going to stress the seams. The hips will pull. The zipper will torque. Move, Madison. The fabric will tear, Mother. It cannot support the weight. If that model takes a long stride, the bodice is going to detach from the skirt. You are going to have a girl naked on the runway. Eleanor stopped. For a second, just a split second, I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. She looked at the dress. She looked at the heavy beads. Then she looked at me, and the doubt vanished, replaced by a sneer. "You are just jealous," she said softly. "You can't stand that I did this without you. You can't stand that I sold the collection you were too slow to finish. I am trying to save you from a lawsuit. You are trying to sabotage me," she hissed. "You always were dramatic, just like your father, always whining about integrity while the rest of us tried to pay the bills." A voice boomed over the intercom. "5 minutes to show. Places, everyone. Places." Eleanor straightened her jacket. She smoothed her hair. The mask of the perfect matriarch slid back into place. "I am going out there to take my bow," she said. "I am going to accept the applause that I have earned. If you are still here when I get back, I will have you arrested for trespassing." She signaled to the security guard standing by the curtain. "Escort her out," she said to him, pointing at me. "After the show starts, I don't want a scene while the press is seated." She didn't look back. She walked toward the stage entrance, the curtain swallowing her whole. The guard moved toward me. He was big and he looked tired. "Come on, miss," he said gently. "Let's go." I stood there for a moment. I could have fought. I could have run onto the stage and screamed the truth. But I looked at the dresses one last time. I saw the strain on the hangers. I saw the cheap glue catching the light. I didn't need to scream. Gravity was about to do the talking for me. "I'll leave," I said to the guard. "But I'm going to watch from the wings, just for a minute." He looked at me, then at the exit. "1 minute, then you're out." I moved to the side of the stage, hiding in the darkness of the wings. Through the gap in the curtains, I could see the runway. The lights dimmed, the music swelled, the bass kicked in again. Thump, thump, thump. My mother walked out. She strode down the runway, waving to the crowd. She looked radiant. She blew kisses. The audience applauded politely. The buyers from Kleinsman were in the front row, beaming, clapping their hands. They thought they had bought the next big thing. Eleanor reached the end of the runway. She posed. She soaked it in. She had no idea that she was standing on a trapdoor, and she had just pulled the lever herself. We've all seen someone cut corners to get ahead, only to have it backfire. It's frustrating to watch, but sometimes you just have to let the pieces fall. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes. The house lights dimmed. The darkness in the room was absolute save for the glow of 1,000 cell phone screens rising in the air like fireflies. The audience was ready. They wanted the spectacle. Then the music hit. It was a jarring industrial beat. Thump, thump, crack. It rattled the rigging overhead. It was too loud, too aggressive. It was my mother trying to prove she was still relevant, still young. I stood in the wings, my hand gripping the cold velvet of the stage curtain. I couldn't breathe. "Go," the stage manager whispered into his headset. The first model stepped out. She was a tall girl named Sasha. I knew her. She walked with a long, predatory stride. She was wearing the opening look, a column dress in ivory crepe. From the side, I saw her wince. As she walked, the dress didn't flow. It bounced. The fabric was too stiff. It bunched around her hips like cheap paper. Every time she took a step, I could see the material straining across her thighs. She reached the end of the runway. She posed. The audience clapped. It was polite, measured. They hadn't noticed yet. "Send two," the manager said. "Go, go." The second model walked out. This was the trouble. This was the showstopper. It was the gown I had begged my mother not to send. The bodice was encrusted with heavy glass beads stitched onto a fragile synthetic illusion net. The model, a girl of maybe 19, stepped into the light. The dress sparkled. For a moment it was beautiful. It was a lie, but a beautiful one. The crystals caught the spotlights and threw rainbows across the ceiling. The audience leaned forward. I saw the buyers from the Kleinsman group in the front row. They were smiling. They were seeing dollar signs. The model reached the end of the runway. She planted her foot to pivot, and then I heard it. It wasn't a loud sound. It was sharp, distinct, like a dry twig snapping in a quiet forest. Zip pop. The plastic zipper at the back of the bodice failed. The tension was too much. The cheap teeth snapped under the torque of the turn. The bodice, weighed down by 5 pounds of glass, instantly lost its structure. It gaped open at the back. The front sagged heavily, sliding down the model's chest. She gasped. Her hands flew up to her chest to catch the dress before she was exposed in front of 500 people and a bank of cameras. She froze. Her eyes were wide, terrified. But gravity doesn't wait for dignity. The sudden movement of her catching the dress put stress on the waist seam. Reep! The sound was agonizing. It was the sound of fabric tearing away from glue. The heavy skirt detached from the bodice on the left side. And then the rain began. The vibration of the tear snapped the single continuous thread, holding the beadwork. Tink, 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 tink. The beads began to fall. They hit the hard, polished runway floor like hail. Thousands of them, a cascade of glass shattering and bouncing on the white surface. The music kept thumping. Thump, thump, crack. The audience didn't scream. They went silent. A collective, horrified inhale sucked the air out of the room. The model was stranded at the end of the runway, clutching a disintegrating dress to her body, standing in a puddle of broken glass. "Cut the music!" someone screamed from the tech booth. But it was too late. The third model had already started her walk. She didn't see the beads on the floor. She was blinded by the spotlights. She took 3 strides. Her heel landed on a rolling glass bead. She went down, hard. She sprawled onto the runway, her legs tangling in the hem of her own gown. As she fell, her dress, a chiffon A-line, caught on her heel. Snap! The strap broke. The hem tore. It was a domino effect of incompetence. In 30 seconds, the bridal renaissance had turned into a graveyard of cheap polyester and broken glass. The silence in the room broke. First came the whispers, a low, buzzing hive of judgment. Then came the laughter. Not joyful laughter, cruel, shocked laughter, the kind that ends careers. I saw the Kleinsman buyers stand up. Mr. Sterling, the head buyer, wasn't laughing. His face was a mask of purple rage. He threw his program onto the floor and pointed a finger at the stage, shouting something I couldn't hear over the rising commotion. I stepped back into the darkness of the wings. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but my hands were steady. It was done. The lie was exposed. Backstage was a riot. The models were running off the runway, tears streaming down their faces, holding their clothes together. "It fell off," Sasha was screaming. "The whole thing just fell off." Eleanor was standing near the monitor, clutching the edge of a table. She looked like she was having a stroke. Her skin was gray. Her mouth was opening and closing, but no sound was coming out. The curtain to the front of the house flew open. Mr. Sterling stormed in. He was a short man, but in that moment he looked 10 feet tall. He was followed by 2 lawyers. "Eleanor!" he roared. My mother flinched. She turned to him, putting on a shaky, desperate smile. "Mr. Sterling, please. It was a technical malfunction. The humidity." "Don't you dare!" Sterling spat. He walked up to the rack of remaining clothes and ripped a dress off the hanger. He held it up to her face. "Look at this," he shouted. He pulled at a seam. It came apart in his hands with a sickening, tearing sound. "Glue, you used glue. We paid $2.5 million for glue." "It was the manufacturer," Eleanor cried. backing away. They switched the specs. I didn't know. I am a victim here. You are a fraud. Sterling threw the dress on the floor. You sold us a luxury line and you delivered garbage. You have damaged the Kleinsman brand. The press is out there tweeting that our exclusive collection is a joke. We can fix it, Eleanor begged. Her voice was shrill cracking. I can have them restitched. Give me a week. I am not giving you a minute, Sterling said. His voice dropped to a low, dangerous growl. I want my money back. All of it. The deposit, the second tranche, the marketing budget, everything by tomorrow morning. I can't, Eleanor whispered. Then I will sue you, Sterling said. I will sue this company into the ground. I will seize your inventory. I will seize your trademark. I will seize this building if I have to. Eleanor straightened up. She looked desperate, cornered like a rat in a trap. She looked around the room and saw me standing in the shadows. Her eyes narrowed. She pointed a trembling finger at me. She did it, Eleanor shrieked. The room went quiet. The models stopped crying. Sterling turned to look at me. She is the pattern maker, Eleanor yelled, her voice hysterical. She sabotaged the specs. She was angry that I fired her. This is her fault. I stepped out of the shadows. I walked into the center of the circle. I didn't look at my mother. I looked at Mr. Sterling. She is lying, I said. My voice was calm. It cut through the hysteria like a cold wind. Of course she is, Sterling muttered. He looked at me, taking in my wet coat, my messy hair. Who are you? I am Madison Berry, I said. I designed this collection, but I did not make these dresses. I walked over to the dress Sterling had thrown on the floor. I picked it up. This is polyester, I said. I specified Italian silk. This is a plastic zipper. I specified invisible steel. I looked at my mother. You didn't pay the manufacturer for the good materials, did you? You pocketed the difference. Eleanor lunged at me. You ungrateful little... Sterling stepped between us. He looked at Eleanor with pure disgust. I don't care whose fault it is, Sterling said. I want my $2.5 million, or I own you, Eleanor. I will take your house, I will take your car, and I will take the Berry Atelier building. Eleanor let out a sharp, jagged laugh. She looked at me with a twisted sense of triumph. Go ahead, she said to Sterling. Sue me. I spent the cash and the building. You can't take the building. Watch me, Sterling said. You can't, Eleanor sneered, because I don't own it. She turned to me, her eyes gleaming with malice. She thought she had found a way out. She thought she could dump the ruin on me. My daughter owns the building, Eleanor said. Her grandfather left it to her in a trust. It's her name on the deed. If you want to seize the property for the debt you have, to sue her. She smiled. It was a cruel, satisfied smile. She was throwing me to the wolves to save herself. Sterling turned to me, his eyes narrowing. Is that true? You own the property. I looked at my mother. She looked so smug. She thought she had played the ultimate card. She thought I would crumble. I didn't crumble. I straightened my spine. Yes, I said clearly, I own the building. It is a historic landmark in Midtown Manhattan. It is valued at $4.5 million. The number hung in the air. $4.5 million? Eleanor's smile faltered. She saw the look on my face. It wasn't fear. It was power. And, I continued, turning to Sterling, since I own the building and my mother is currently 3 months behind on the rent she pays to the trust, I can evict her. Tonight. Eleanor's face went white. You wouldn't, she whispered. I can, I said. And I can also terminate her lease for conducting fraudulent business on the premises, which means, Mr. Sterling, if you sue her, you get nothing. She has no assets. She has no building. She has nothing but a closet full of polyester rags. Sterling looked from me to Eleanor. He did the math. He realized the mother was a husk. The daughter held the equity. So, Sterling said, looking at me with new interest, you have the building, you have the value, but I still have a ruined show and a hole in my budget. I know, I said. Madison, Eleanor grabbed my arm. Her grip was painful. Stop this. Tell him we will work it out. I pulled my arm away. I looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in years. I saw the fear behind the makeup. I saw the emptiness. There is no we anymore, Mother, I said, softly. I turned back to Sterling. You want a collection, Mr. Sterling? You want couture? You want to save your reputation? I want a miracle, Sterling snapped. I don't have a miracle, I said, but I have a van parked outside. Sterling raised an eyebrow. A van. I have the original prototypes, I said. The ones I made with my own hands before she locked me out. The silk, the real crystals, the structure. The room went dead silent. How many? Sterling asked. 12 looks, I said. A capsule collection, but they are perfect. Eleanor gasped. You stole them. I saved them, I corrected. I took them home to finish the beadwork the night before you changed the locks. I looked Sterling in the eye. I can put them on these girls right now. We can send them out for a second finale. We can tell the press the first half was performance art, a commentary on fast fashion, but the second half is the real Berry legacy. Sterling stared at me. He looked at the ruined dress on the floor. He looked at the weeping models. Then he looked at the steel in my eyes. You have 10 minutes, he said. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us are the ones who throw us into the fire. But fire clarifies things. It shows you what is gold and what is just cheap plastic. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes. You have 10 minutes, Sterling said, his voice flat. He didn't sound hopeful. He sounded like a man who had just watched $2 million evaporate into thin air and was grasping at the last floating piece of wreckage. I nodded and turned to the security guard, the same one who had let me in earlier. I need you to open the loading dock. My van is right outside. It's the white Ford. He looked at Eleanor, then at Sterling, and finally at me. He nodded and ran toward the exit. The backstage area was still a disaster zone. Models were wiping mascara from their cheeks. Dressers were picking up pieces of broken glass. The smell of fear was slowly being replaced by a strange, heavy quiet. Eleanor slumped into a folding chair. She looked small. The grand dame of 7th Avenue was gone, replaced by an old woman in a stained silk suit. She didn't look at me. She stared at her hands trembling in her lap. I lost it, she whispered. The inheritance, the legacy, it's all gone. I paused. I could have walked away. I could have let her sit in that chair and rot. She had tried to frame me. She had tried to destroy me. But then I saw a figure emerge from the shadows near the makeup stations. It was Juliana Vance. If you don't know fashion, you might not know the name. But in this world, Juliana is royalty. She has been the editor of the Vanguard for 30 years. She is known for wearing sunglasses indoors and for writing reviews so scathing they have caused designers to retire. She walked through the chaos like she was strolling through a garden. She stepped over a pile of ruined polyester without looking down. She walked straight up to me. She took off her sunglasses. Her eyes were sharp gray and unreadable. I recognize the hand that drew these patterns, she said. Her voice was low, raspy from years of cigarettes. She gestured to the heap of ruined dresses on the floor, the architecture of the skirt, the line of the bodice. That is a Berry design, she said, but I do not recognize the hand that sewed them. That was not you, Madison. No, I said. It wasn't. Juliana looked at Eleanor, who was still staring at her hands. Juliana didn't say anything cruel. She just shook her head, a tiny, disappointed movement. A sketch is a promise, Juliana said, turning back to me. And your mother broke it. But the question is, can you keep it? She looked at the garment bag I was holding, my emergency kit containing my tools. Then she looked toward the loading dock where the guard was rolling in a rack of garment bags from my van. Are you going to fix this, Madison? She asked. I looked at the rack. My girls were in there, the real ones. Yes, I said. Juliana nodded once. Then get to work. I'll hold the press. She turned and walked back out toward the audience. I watched her go. It was a strange moment of grace. She didn't have to help, too. She could have written the headline, Berry Empire Collapses in Scandal. Instead, she was giving me a chance. I clapped my hands. The sound echoed in the quiet room. All right, I shouted. Listen to me. The models looked up. The dressers stopped sweeping. Forget the run sheet, I said, my voice steady. Forget the music. We are starting over. Sasha, strip that off. You're opening. But my hair, Sasha said, touching her messy bun. Leave it, I said. Messy is real. Real is what we need right now. I unzipped the first garment bag. The smell of lavender and cedar drifted out. I pulled out the real opening look. It was a slip dress made of heavy bias-cut silk in a shade of pale oyster. It didn't have sequins. It didn't have feathers. It relied entirely on the cut. I handed it to Sasha. She touched the fabric and sighed. Oh, this is different. It's real, I said. For the next 8 minutes, we worked in a frenzy. But it wasn't the chaotic panic of before. It was the rhythm of professionals. I stripped the cheap polyester off the models and dressed them in the capsule collection. I didn't have 30 looks. I had 12. But each one was perfect. I put the showstopper on the youngest model, the one who had been left exposed on the runway. I'm scared, she whispered. I don't want to go back out there. Look at me, I said, fastening the hooks of the bodice. These hooks were steel. I had sewn them on with double waxed thread. This dress will not fall. I built the corset myself. It will hold you up. You just walk. She took a deep breath and nodded. Mr. Sterling, I called out. He walked over. He looked skeptical, but he was watching. No music, I said. Cut the sound system. Turn up the house lights just a little. I want them to see the fabric. No music, he asked. It'll be dead silent. Exactly, I said. I turned to the models. They were lined up. They looked beautiful, not flashy, not desperate, just elegant. Go, I said. Sasha walked out. The silence in the auditorium was heavy. The audience was still confused, still whispering about the disaster. Then Sasha stepped onto the runway. There was no thumping bass to hide behind. There were no flashing lights, just the sound of her heels on the floor. Click, click, click. And the sound of the silk. Swish, swish. She reached the end of the runway and turned. The dress moved like liquid. It caught the air and swirled around her legs before settling perfectly back into place. I heard a gasp from the front row. A good gasp. The second model walked out, then the third. The audience stopped whispering. They leaned in. Without the distraction of the loud music and the light show, they were forced to look at the clothes. And what they saw was craftsmanship. They saw French seams. They saw hand-rolled hems. They saw dignity. Juliana Vance was sitting in the front row next to Sterling. I saw her lean over and whisper something to him. He nodded slowly. The anger in his shoulders was relaxing. Finally, the young model walked out in the real finale gown. It was heavy silk organza with thousands of tiny seed pearls, but it didn't drag. The internal structure lifted the weight off her hips. She didn't look terrified. She looked regal. She walked to the end of the runway, pivoted, and stood there. The dress didn't rip. The zipper didn't pop. It just shone soft and pearlescent under the lights. For a long moment, there was total silence. Then one person started to clap, then another. Then the whole room rose. It wasn't the polite applause of the beginning. It was a roar. It was relief. They were cheering because they had seen something real. I stood in the wings watching. I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned. It was my mother. She was standing next to me, watching the ovation. Tears were streaming down her face, but they weren't tears of joy. They were tears of realization. "They never clapped for me like that," she whispered. "No," I said softly, "they didn't." She looked at me, and for the first time, I didn't see the monster who had locked me out. I saw a woman who had spent her whole life chasing a reflection in a mirror only to realize the glass was empty. "I'm sorry," she said. It was barely audible. I looked back at the stage, at the triumph I had built with my own bleeding fingers. "I know," I said, "but sorry doesn't pay the rent, Mother." I saw Mr. Sterling walking toward us from the house. He had a contract in his hand. "Madison," he said, ignoring Eleanor completely, "we need to talk. We've all had people who doubted us, or worse, tried to take credit for our work. It feels good to prove them wrong, doesn't it? Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes." The applause had faded. The house lights were up. The magic of the runway had evaporated, leaving behind the cold, hard reality of business. We were sitting in the small production office backstage. It was a cramped room that smelled of stale coffee and toner ink. Mr. Sterling sat across from me, a thick document on the metal desk between us. My mother sat in the corner. She hadn't spoken since the show ended. She looked like a ghost in a silk suit, pale, trembling, and utterly defeated. "I need a signature," Sterling said, tapping the paper. "But let me be clear. I am buying your designs, Madison. I am buying the Berry name because you saved it tonight. But I will not do business with a fraud." He didn't look at Eleanor, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. "If she is the owner," Sterling continued, "I walk, and I take my $2.5 million with me." I looked at the contract. It was a transfer of executive control. It was a document that would strip my mother of her title, her authority, and her pride. Eleanor made a small choking sound. "Madison," she whispered. She didn't beg. She didn't have the energy left to beg. She just looked at me with terrified eyes. She knew I had the power to destroy her. I owned the building. I had the talent. And now I had the buyer. I could have evicted her. I could have let Sterling sue her for fraud. I could have watched her go to prison for the embezzlement of the fabric funds. It would have been justice. It would have been exactly what she deserved for locking me out in the rain. I picked up the pen. It felt heavy in my hand. I looked at my mother. I didn't see the tyrant who had screamed at me for crooked hems. I saw an old woman who was terrified of being forgotten. I saw a woman who had run a race she couldn't win, simply because she didn't know how to stop running. "You're right, Mr. Sterling," I said, quietly. "You can't do business with her." I signed the paper. Madison Berry, CEO and creative director. Eleanor flinched as if I had struck her. She closed her eyes, tears leaking out from under her lashes. She was waiting for the eviction notice. She was waiting for me to tell her to get out. Mother, I said. She opened her eyes. You are tired, I said gently. You have been fighting for this empire for 40 years. You chased the fame so hard you forgot the craft. It is time to rest. I have nowhere to go, she whispered. I spent everything. I know, I said. I saw the books. You owe $40,000 to the silk mill. You owe $12,000 in back taxes. She looked down ashamed. I paid them, I said. Her head snapped up. What? I liquidated my portfolio this morning, I said. The debts are paid. The liens are cleared. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small envelope. I slid it across the desk to her. And I bought the cottage in the Hudson Valley, I said. The one with the garden you always talked about. It's small, but it's paid for. She stared at the envelope. Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely pick it up. Why? She asked, her voice cracking. After what I did to you. Because you are my mother, I said, and because the Berry name means something. It means dignity. I won't let you end up on the street, and I won't let you rot in a cell. I stood up. I felt lighter than I had in years. There is a stipend, I added. Enough for groceries, enough for heating oil, enough for a quiet life. But that is it, Mother. You are done. You will never step foot in the atelier again. You will never speak to the press. You go to the country and you find some peace. She stood up slowly. She clutched the envelope to her chest like a shield. She looked at me, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the mother I had wanted as a child, not the business partner, but the parent. Thank you, she whispered. She turned and walked out of the office. She looked smaller than she had when she walked in, stripped of her vanity. But she was safe. Missed her. Sterling watched her go, then looked at me with a strange expression. You're a better woman than I am, Madison, he said. I would have crushed her. Crushing people is easy, I said, picking up my shears from the table. Fixing things is hard. Have you ever held the power to destroy someone who hurt you? It's a heavy thing to carry. In that moment, the choice between revenge and mercy defines who you really are. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes. A week later, I stood alone in the atelier. The space was quiet. The phone wasn't ringing. The hysterical energy of my mother's reign was gone. It was just me, the dress forms and the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. I ran my hand over the cutting table. The wood was scarred from years of work. I thought about revenge. Revenge is a seductive idea. We think it will make us feel powerful. We think that seeing the other person suffer will somehow heal the wound they caused us. But it doesn't. If I had destroyed my mother, I would have had to live in the ruins. I would have been the Queen of Ash. Instead, I chose to build. I chose to take the mess she made and stitch it back together into something stronger. I chose to give her mercy, not because she earned it, but because I didn't want to carry the weight of her destruction for the rest of my life. True power isn't about standing over your enemy while they bleed. True power is having the competence to fix their mistakes, the strength to take the high road, and the grace to let them walk away with their dignity intact. I picked up the heavy steel shears. I unrolled a bolt of fresh white silk. The past was finished. It was time to draft something new. Shah, clack. Madison found peace by rebuilding rather than destroying. Have you ever had to be the bigger person in a family conflict, even when it hurt to do so? Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might be the inspiration for our future episodes. We read every single comment. We truly appreciate you being here. There are even more captivating stories waiting for you right on your screen. Please click one now so you don't miss the ending. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. This has been a story from Ashes of Revenge. We'll see you next time.